Alright, alright, pardon my voice, a little gravelly today. We're working on a 1995 Honda Accord. This is the EX Coupe. Supplies to all of the 1994 through 1997 Honda Accords, whether a coupe, sedan, or wagon. All the front brake assemblies are the same. Specifically, we're working on the front brakes. The procedure will be very similar to the rear brakes, but not identical. So what I'm replacing today is the rotors, the hubs, and bearing packs back here. And I'm coming to this a little bit late. I decided as I'm putting back together the second one, I might as well do a quick cap on what you got to do. So when you take off your wheel, which if you don't want to take off your wheel, there's plenty of videos for that. Once you get your wheel off and you're up in the air, I found it easiest to do both up in the air at the same time. So break both wheels free, jack it up, center the car, both wheels off, use jack stands, because you will be moving the car a lot. You don't want to tip over and fall on you. So we've got both wheels off. We come to either side. I started with the passenger side, thinking it would be harder because I haven't done as much work over there, but it actually ended up being easier. So once you get through that, you're going to want to come and loosen up your caliper. And your caliper is held on the back with 2 bolts here and there. Those mount up here and here. That's the entire caliper assembly. Those are 17mm bolts. I found it easiest to use a larger half-drive ratchet than a smaller 3/8. Once you take that off, most people like to take your caliper and zip tie it to something like this bar here or up in the assembly. I found it was going to be in the way in all those conditions. So what I did, especially since you're going to have to anyways, is I came over here and mounted right here are 2 little 10mm that hold on your brake rubber tube. And once you undo that and you set it down on the ground, there's not actually tension on the hose. It's pretty loose, so you're not actually stretching the hose out, which is a big concern. So once you get your caliper off, you set it aside. I also, since this is the EX, have a speed sensor. So I went and took my speed sensor off. If you have one of those, it's going to be mounted on the tie rod side, and it's going to be down under your castle nut for your tie rod. Right down under here, you'll see 2 12mm where the sensor's attached. It'll come up and around the hub arm, and then I'll have these bolts here, 2 10mm. You'll do all those 2 and the other 2. I'll just set that aside. No worry about tension on it. It's just a wire. And then once you've got those things set aside, you're going to want to go to the top. I go to the top because I have adjustable upper ball joints, so they come off extremely easily. Instead of having to break free the actual castle nut right here, I just have a hex nut on top with a lock washer that mounts up to my control arm. Now, if you are doing this with stock ball joints and you don't want to have to replace this ball joint by potentially damaging it, you can go up into the engine bay right here and there on both sides of the control arm and undo the 17mm, I think it's 17, there might be 21s that hold in the control arm. You can just push those down through and your whole assembly will come forward. And then that will free up your top. And then obviously, as you're going to have to take off your tie rod, which is a 17mm as well, take off the nut. I usually just use a hammer to pound it out to get it to come out, because doing any type of ball joint pullers, you tend to risk damaging the rubber booting. If you're not looking and wanting to do a tie rod adjustment, make sure you take your tie rod and set it down the exact direction it was. If this twists at all and rotates, it'll change the depth drive of your tie rod and it won't be straight anymore. But if you're doing bearings, you're going to need alignment anyways. But if you're doing the alignment yourself, this is one less step to deal with. So now that all that's taken off, you should have free control of your entire knuckle assembly. And it'll look similar to what I got here. You should be able to, at that point, not at that point, you should come to the front and you'll have your axle nut here, which is a 36mm. And usually they have a little indent. You can see that right there. That locks them on there. You're going to want to bend that indent out and break it free. Get that nut off. And then you'll have full play of your axle back here, which will just come out of your knuckle assembly. I usually do the axle nut first because while the caliper's on, you can take a screwdriver, slide it in between your rotor pads and lock it against the caliper as you go to loosen the nut so your rotor doesn't spin. Most people usually opt to do something like put the car in gear or lock it some other means. I find this to be really easy. If you've got a thick screwdriver, it's not going to bend. Especially if you replace the rotors already, any damage you do to them is negligible. So that'll get your axle nut off, and then you'll have full play of your axle, like I said. And once you get your axle backed out, you'll find on the inside of your assembly here, you'll have 4 of these 12 millimeter bolts that hold in your bearing hub assembly. You're going to want to break all of those free. I found it easiest to do this with a modified breaker bar, since I only have a 12 mil 3/8 drive. Half drive wouldn't fit back there with the axle really, because the axle isn't quite enough to get out. I used my 12 mil 3/8, grabbed my 3/8 ratchet, and used a jack arm to give myself a nice breaker bar distance. They came out pretty easily. The other option is you can come down to the bottom and take off the castle nut on your bottom ball joint and just take the whole knuckle assembly out and do this outside of the car. I opted not to do this because 1, I don't have a press to press out my bearing, so there's no point in taking out for me, and 2, I just did the lower ball joints about 4 months ago, and I find it very, very hard to get them undone without damaging the ball joint boot, so I opted to leave them on. Once you get that free, all 4 of those bolts free, you're then going to be beating your hub assembly off. So, especially since I'm replacing the rotor, I don't care about damaging the rotor, the hub, or the bearing assembly, all being replaced. One thing to worry about is don't damage your flat surfaces where things mount. Bolts back there, bolts here, inside the plate area here. You want that all to be flush and flat. And so I ended up using an air ratchet, an air chisel, and I chiseled the back of my rotor, I chiseled the back of my hub, I chiseled the back of my bearing, being very careful not to tap the axle, not to tap the back of the knuckle. And this gave me some looseness on the assembly. And then I went at it with a 4-pound mini sledge and just went around beating here, 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 and down here to slowly wiggle this free. Don't take the thought process of if I smack it and spin it and smack it, it'll come loose. You're only beating one section of the bearing assembly. You need to go all the way around to slowly loosen it. At some point it will just come off. On my second one, I actually had my bearing and hub separate, so then I had my bearing left stuck inside of there, and I ended up having to chisel it even more to get it out. Again, being extremely careful not to damage your flat surfaces on the inside. Now, you may not have access to an air chisel, or specifically air tools. That's where you're going to have to be taking out the whole knuckle assembly, and you're going to want to take, I forget what size it is, but you can get a socket the exact size of the back of your bearing, set it on there, and beat it over a table with a sledge, and it will pop it free. Again, didn't want to damage my lower ball joints, already replaced, not looking to replace them again. So once you get all that out, then you are going to put in your new stuff, which I opted to buy the bearing hub press kit, which means these are already pressed together, so I don't have to press them myself. And then I got myself some carbon rotors, and I reused the 4 bolts here that mount the rotor to the hub assembly. They usually kind of stiff, so you may want to think about breaking them free before you start taking apart this entire assembly. I didn't end up needing to. I was able to lock mine down with a chain and just kind of wrench on it with a breaker bar, and they all came free pretty easily. I reused them because they're in decent condition. None of the threads are damaged. This is one of those situations where you might want to start using Loctite on things like your bearing bolts, your rotor bolts, just to keep them nice and tight. So once you get those clipped together outside of the car, you bring it over and you line up your bearing hub assembly with your holes. You'll notice that the back of it is not symmetrical. There are 2 bolts that are farther and 2 bolts that are closer. The farther ones point forwards to the car, and if you just look at the bolt pattern on the car, you'll see that. So you line it up, I found it easiest to put one of these bolts through so I could line up easily and just grab a few threads and then go to the opposite side, so diagonally, put the other one in, tighten them down just a little bit, and then get my other two in and just go around in a circle and bring it down. The upside to the new bearing hub assemblies that AutoZone carries, which is where I bought my parts, is that they are not really press tight like the original factory ones were. That's why these had to be smacked out so hard. The new style is slightly undersized just by a small fraction in one of the rivets. If you look at them closely, if you get the new stuff, you'll see there's a little line where it's milled out a little bit. That makes it easier for it to slide in and out, which in the future will make rotor changes easier instead of having to beat all this assembly apart. It should come off fairly easily. So right now what I'm doing is I'm putting my bolts in and tightening it down. So basically everything will be in reverse order. I've got one complete over here. Oh, it's a little dark. I've got one complete over here with everything back together. So like I said, you're going to tighten down your bolts to your hub. Once you get those nice and tight, you're going to slide your axle in and line up your splines. I found that a good time to tighten down the axle nut to keep my axle in place so it's nice and lined up. I don't have to mess with it later. And then next I went up and did the upper control arm bolt for me, but if it's you have to put those two in the back there back in, or I have to put in a new ball joint. Put that in so that it's now sealed top and bottom so it doesn't play anymore. Then put your tie rods in with your castle nuts. If you notice, I don't have castle nuts in mine. These are aftermarket tie rods that come with a lock nut instead. Once you get that together, start putting your wire back on. If you've got a speed sensor wire, don't put your caliper tube on yet. You want to put your caliper itself back on. I also went and did a caliper upgrade, which is the whole reason for all this. Swapped out my calipers for new ones. That's going to require you undoing your little banjo bolt back here, hook up to your new caliper, put your bolts into your bracket, and then put your two 10 mils back into your hose there. And that will pretty much shore up everything you need to do. Make sure your pads are good. If you're already doing all this, if your pads are even past 50%, this is a good time to do it anyways. After doing hubs, bearings, anything like that, it does require an alignment. I find this obviously a good time to go do that. So get an alignment done and you should be set on new rotors, hubs, and bearings.